Some deals look too good to be true because they are. When 75-year-old investment mogul Walter Harrington shook hands on a heritage resort project at his country club, he thought he'd found the perfect legacy investment. The handsome young developers had all the right answers, the glossy brochures, and promises of preserving local history. But during Sunday brunch, his 9-year-old granddaughter Ellie tugged his sleeve. "Grandpa," she whispered, "the deal is a scam. I heard them lying about the land." Walter's blood ran cold. In 50 years of business, he'd learned to trust his instincts, but could a child really spot what he'd missed?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The morning sun filtered through the mahogany blinds of Walter Harrington's study, casting golden stripes across decades of investment journals. Each leather-bound volume represented a year of careful decisions, calculated risks, and the steady accumulation of wealth that had transformed a young accountant into one of Connecticut's most respected investment advisors. Walter sat in his worn leather chair, the same one Margaret had surprised him with on their 20th anniversary, and opened his current journal dot. His fountain pen moved across the cream-colored pages with practiced precision. March 15th, Heritage. Resort development, initial commitment pending. The words seemed to mock him now, hours after Ellie's warning. In 50 years of business, he developed an almost supernatural ability to spot deception, to read the subtle tells in a nervous entrepreneur's presentation. How had a 9-year-old seen what he'd missed? Walter's fingers traced the edge of a framed photograph on his desk. Margaret smiled back at him, forever frozen at 65, her eyes holding that mixture of warmth and shrewd intelligence that had made her his most trusted advisor. "Keep it safe for the grandchildren," she'd whispered in those final days. "Not just the money, Walter. The wisdom, the integrity. That's the real inheritance." A Heritage Resort prospectus lay open beside his journal, its glossy pages promising a return to elegance, a celebration of local history, substantial returns for founding investors. The renderings showed colonial-style buildings nestled among preserved oak trees, walking paths that honored the land's agricultural heritage. It was exactly the kind of project Margaret would have loved: preservation with purpose, profit with principle. But now, studying it with fresh eyes, tiny inconsistencies emerged like cracks in fine china. The historical timeline mentioned a mill that Walter, a lifelong resident, had never heard of. The architectural firm's address led to a strip mall in Newark. Small things easily explained away unless you were looking for them. He reached for his telephone, the heavy black rotary model he'd refused to replace despite his secretary's protests. Some things worked better the old way. His fingers found Harold Pemberton's number from memory. "Pemby," he said when his old friend answered, "it's Walter. I need to talk to you about something. In person, if you don't mind." "Everything all right, Walt?" Harold's voice carried the weight of 40 years of friendship. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. Can you pull the preliminary paperwork on that Heritage Resort deal? The one from the Thornfield Group?" "Of course. Though I should mention, Walt, 3 more of our friends signed commitment letters yesterday." Jim Morrison put in $200,000. Walter's jaw tightened. Jim had just lost his wife to cancer. The last thing he needed was to lose his savings. "2. I'll be there in an hour, Pemby. And do me a favor. Keep those commitment letters in your desk for now. Don't process anything yet." After hanging up, Walter stood and walked to the window. His property stretched out before him, 10 acres of memories. The tire swing where he'd pushed his children still hung from the giant oak. The greenhouse where Margaret had nurtured her orchids stood empty now, but maintained, waiting. This wasn't just about money. It was about trust, about the community of retirees who looked to him for guidance, about promises made to a woman whose wisdom still guided him from beyond. Ellie's warning echoed in his mind. Such a simple statement from such a young voice. But it had shaken something loose in his perception. Perhaps that was the gift of youth, the ability to see clearly what experience had taught you to rationalize away. Walter closed his journal, capped his fountain pen, and reached for his coat. The Heritage Resort folder went into his briefcase, along with something he hadn't carried in years, doubt. As he passed through the hallway, he paused at a photo from last Christmas. Ellie grinned at the camera, gap-toothed and triumphant, having just beaten him at chess for the first time. Trust your instincts, Margaret had always said. Today, his instincts were speaking through his granddaughter's voice. It was time to listen. The country club's Sunday brunch had been a Harrington tradition for 3 decades. The same corner, table by the bay window, the same weathered leather menu that Walter never actually read, the same gentle murmur of conversation, punctuated by the clink of sterling silver on china. But this Sunday felt different, charged with an electric current of unease that seemed to emanate from the sketch pad tucked under Ellie's arm. "Tell me again, sweetheart," Walter said, cutting into his Eggs Benedict with deliberate calm. "Exactly what you heard in the powder room." Ellie set down her orange juice, her face serious in that way children adopt when they know adults are finally listening. "I was washing my hands, and these 2 ladies came in. They didn't see me because I was in the last stall, the one with the fancy wallpaper that looks like birds." Walter nodded encouragingly. The powder room's layout was infamous among the club's female members. That last stall was practically invisible from the mirror area. One lady said, "I can't believe they're falling for it," and the other one laughed. "Not a nice laugh, Grandpa? A mean one." Then she said, "These old fools think they're buying history. They're buying us a beach house in Costa Rica." The Eggs Benedict turned to sawdust in Walter's mouth. He forced himself to swallow, reached for his water glass. Around them, the dining room hummed with its usual Sunday energy. Judge Harrison was holding court at his regular table, regaling his companions with fishing stories. The Pemberton twins were celebrating their 75th birthday with a cake that seemed to require its own zip code. "Did you see these ladies?" "Ellie?" She nodded, already flipping open her sketch pad. "I draw everyone interesting I see. Mommy says it's good practice for my art class." The sketches were remarkably detailed for a 9-year-old's work. 2 women rendered in confident pencil strokes, one tall and angular with a severe bob, the other shorter with elaborate jewelry. But it was the 3rd sketch that made Walter's breath catch. The woman from the first drawing stood beside a man. In an expensive suit, his hand on her lower back in a gesture that spoke of intimacy. The man was David Thornfield, lead developer of the Heritage Resort project. This lady, Ellie pointed to the angular woman, was wearing a pin shaped like a butterfly, blue and gold. And she had a funny accent, like she was trying to sound fancy, but forgot sometimes. Walter's mind raced. David Thornfield had introduced himself as a widower, had spoken movingly about wanting to create something his late wife would have been proud of. It was a story calculated to resonate with the country club's demographic, many of whom were navigating leaf after loss. Mr. Harrington. A hearty voice interrupted his thoughts. Spencer Whitman approached their table, his face flushed with excitement and what appeared to be several mimosas. "Glad I caught you. I'm putting in another 100,000 on the Heritage Project. David says if we can close the initial funding round by Friday, we'll get an extra 2% on returns." "Friday?" Walter kept his voice neutral. "That seems rather rushed. Strike while the iron's hot, that's what I say." Spencer clapped him on the shoulder. "Martha's already planning what we'll do with the returns. Wants to take the grandkids to Europe. First class all the way." After Spencer departed, Walter turned back to Ellie, who was adding details to a new sketch, the dining room scene unfolding. Around them, her young eyes missed nothing, capturing the way Spencer's wife sat alone at their table, shoulders tense. obviously uncomfortable with her husband's investment enthusiasm. "Ellie," Walter said quietly, "I believe you. Every word. And you've helped Grandpa more than you know." She beamed at him, then grew serious again. "The mean ladies, Grandpa, they scared me. They talked about the old people like they were just wallets with legs." The phrase, so incongruous from a child's lips, clearly something overheard and repeated, sent a chill down Walter's spine. He looked around the dining room with new eyes. How many of these friends, these good people who had worked their entire lives for their retirement security, were about to lose everything to a pretty brochure and a practiced smile? Judge Harrison laughed at something, the sound carrying across the room. The Pemberton twins were posing for photos with their cake. Spencer Wickman was glad-handing his way from table to table, spreading enthusiasm for the Heritage Resort, like a virus. Walter folded his napkin with precise movements, a gesture Margaret had always recognized as his transition from thought to action. "Ellie, would you like to come with Grandpa on some errands this week? I might need an assistant with sharp eyes and good instincts." His granddaughter's face lit up. "Really? Like a detective?" "Exactly like a detective," Walter confirmed, signaling for the check. "But first, we need to see a friend of mine who keeps very careful records. Uncle Harold has some papers I need to look at." As they prepared to leave, Ellie tucked her sketch pad under her arm, its pages holding more truth than any glossy investment brochure. Walter noticed she'd captured one more detail in her drawing of the dining room, a figure standing in the doorway, watching. David Thornfield himself, his expression unreadable, but his presence unmistakable. The game, as they say, was afoot. Harold Pemberton's office existed in a time warp, a pocket of 1975 preserved in amber and mahogany. While other banks had embraced glass and steel, digital displays and automated everything, Harold's corner of First Connecticut Savings remained defiantly analog. Ledgers lined the walls like ancient texts, their spines labeled in his precise handwriting. A mechanical adding machine sat on his desk, its keys worn smooth by decades of calculations. "Walt, Ellie, come in, come in." Harold rose from behind his desk, his movements careful but dignified. At 78, he was 3 years Walter's senior, and showed it in the deliberate way he navigated his domain. "Can I offer you some tea? Coffee? I believe we still have some of those butter cookies you like, Ellie." While Harold fussed with hospitality, Walter studied his friend. They'd met in 1973, two young men trying to make their mark in finance. Harold had chosen banking, Walter investments, but their philosophies aligned: careful growth, personal relationships, and a radical notion that a handshake still meant something. "Pemby," Walter said once they were settled, "I need to see everything you have on the Heritage Resort development, particularly the Thornfield Group's financial statements." Harold's fingers drummed once on his desk, a tell Walter recognized. "I was wondering when you'd ask. Something felt off when they came in last month. Too smooth, if you know what I mean. Like they'd rehearsed every answer." He rose and walked to a filing cabinet that looked like it had survived the Eisenhower administration. The drawer opened with a protesting squeak, and Harold extracted a manila folder thick with papers. But instead of handing it over immediately, he held it close to his chest. "Before we dive into this, Walt, I need you to know something. I've already received transfer instructions from 6 of our members. Total commitment, $1.3 million. The transfers are scheduled for this Friday." Walter felt Ellie shift. Beside him, her sketch pad balanced on her knees. She was drawing again, capturing Harold's office in quick, confident strokes. The old banker noticed and smiled. "Quite the artist you have there. Reminds me of my granddaughter, though she prefers those computer tablets to proper pencils." "Uncle Harold," Ellie said, not looking up from her work, "do you still use the big books to keep track of money?" "I certainly do, young lady. Every transaction written by hand. My assistant thinks I'm crazy, but I'll tell you a secret. These books have caught more errors than any computer system. He finally handed the folder to Walter, then pulled out one of his legendary ledgers. The leather binding cracked as he opened it, revealing pages of meticulous entries in fountain pen ink. Here's what first caught my attention. Harold pointed to a series of entries. The Thornfield Group opened their account with a wire transfer from a bank in Nevada. Not unusual in itself, but the routing number. He pulled out a magnifying glass, another relic from the past. It belongs to a bank that primarily services casinos. Walter leaned forward, studying the numbers. In the digital age, such connections were often buried in electronic transfers, invisible unless you knew where to look. But Harold's paper trail made the path clear. Then there's this. Harold flipped to another page. They've made several large cash deposits, always just under the recording limit. Classic structuring behavior. In my day, we called it smurfing. What's smurfing? Ellie asked, her pencil pausing. It's when someone breaks up big amounts of money into smaller pieces to avoid attention. Walter explained. Like if you had a giant cookie and broke it into tiny pieces, so no one would notice you eating the whole thing. Ellie nodded solemnly, making a note in the margin of her sketch. Harold continued his paper archaeology, each page revealing another red flag, references that led to disconnected numbers, previous developments that existed only on paper. A web of LLC formations and dissolutions that spoke of entities created for single purposes and abandoned. But here's the smoking gun, Harold said, pulling out a photocopy. I asked my friend at the county recorder's office to send me the property deed. Old Timothy's been there since the Kennedy administration. Still does things the proper way. Look at this signature. Walter examined the document. The signature of the property's supposed owner was dated 3 months ago. So, Timothy remembers this transaction. Said the man who signed was in his 40s. Problem is, Harold pulled out another paper, an obituary. Samuel Morrison died in 2018. Unless the Thornfield Group has discovered resurrection, this deed is forged. The room fell silent except for the tick of Harold's grandfather clock and the scratch of Ellie's pencil. Walter felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with confirmed suspicions. This wasn't just a bad investment. It was deliberate fraud. Can you delay those transfers? Walter asked. I can drag my feet until Thursday, claim system maintenance. But come Friday, I'll have to process them or face legal action. These members signed binding commitments. Walter stood, his mind already racing ahead to next steps. That gives us 4 days. Pemby, I need copies of everything. And can you quietly check if any other banks have received similar transfer instructions? Already ahead of you, Harold smiled grimly. Called my counterparts at 3 other banks this morning. Just friendly chats, you understand. The Thornfield Group has commitment letters totaling over $5 million, all scheduled to transfer Friday. As they prepared to leave, Ellie showed Harold her completed sketch. She'd captured not just the office, but the story unfolding. Within it, the ledgers open like evidence, her grandfather's tense posture, Harold's protective stance over his files. In the corner, she'd drawn something else. A spider's web with dollar signs caught like flies. You've got a smart one here, Walt, Harold said, walking them to the door. Reminds me of why we do this the old way. Computers might be faster, but they can't smell a rat. Outside, the March air was crisp with the promise of spring. Walter helped Ellie into his Lincoln, his mind already turning to the next move. They had 4 days to unravel 50 years of financial experience worth of deception. But they had something the Thornfield Group hadn't counted on. Paper trails, old friends, and a 9-year-old artist who saw truth in the details. Where to now, Grandpa? Ellie asked, already opening to a fresh page in her sketchpad. To see, Another old friend, Walter replied, starting the engine. One who spent his career catching people like the Thornfield Group. If anyone can help us put these pieces together, it's Frank Morrison. As they drove away, neither of them noticed the silver sedan that pulled out 3 cars behind them, maintaining a careful distance. The game was indeed afoot, and the players were beginning to realize the stakes. Frank Morrison's house sat on a quiet street where American flags flew from every other porch, and gardens showed the first green promises of spring. The retired detective answered his door wearing a cardigan that had seen better decades and an expression that suggested he'd been expecting them. Walt, and this must be the famous Ellie. Frank's voice carried the gravelly authority of 40 years in law enforcement. Come on back to my office. I've got some things you need to see. They followed him through a house that spoke of a bachelor's practicality, functional furniture, minimal decoration, but scrupulously clean. His office, however, was another matter entirely. Files covered every surface, photographs were pinned to corkboards, and red string connected various points like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. Don't mind the mess, Frank said, clearing chairs for them. Retirement's supposed to be about golf and fishing. Instead, I catch crooks for free. Coffee? While Frank poured from a pot that looked strong enough to strip paint, Walter studied the organized chaos. His friend had always worked this way, building visual narratives from disparate facts until patterns emerged. It was old-school detective work, the kind that relied on instinct and shoe leather rather than databases and algorithms. So, Frank settled into his desk chair, which creaked in protest. Harold called me. Said you've got concerns about this Heritage Resort business. I've been looking into it since breakfast. He pulled out a manila folder marked Similar Patterns 1990s in his distinctive block printing. Inside were newspaper clippings, police reports, and photographs that told a familiar story. Remember the Meadowbrook Estates scandal, 1993? Frank spread the documents across his desk. Same playbook. Target affluent retirees. Promise a development that honors local history. Create false urgency and vanish with the money. The perpetrators were never caught, but I always suspected they'd surface again. Ellie leaned forward, studying a photograph from the old case. That lady looks like the one I saw, but younger. And her hair's different. Frank and Walter exchanged glances. The detective pulled out a magnifying glass, apparently a required tool for everyone over 70, and examined the photo more closely. You've got good eyes, young lady. The bone structure's similar. Could be the same person, could be a relative. Con artists often work in families, passing down tricks like heirlooms. He moved to another board, this one covered with information about the Thornfield Group. I've been making calls all morning. Old habits, the business address they provided. It's a virtual office, rented by the month. The references they gave? 2 are disconnected numbers. One goes to a confused elderly woman in Boca Raton who's never heard of them. How do they get away with it? Walter asked, though he suspected he knew the answer, because they're smart about target selection. Frank moved to his window, gazing out at his peaceful street. They choose people with money, but maybe not heirs who'd ask questions. They pick communities where everyone knows everyone, where trust is assumed, and they always create time pressure. He turned back to them, his weathered face grave. Friday's not random. Walt, banks process large transfers in batches end of week. By Monday morning, that money could be in 10 different accounts across 5 countries, untraceable, unrecoverable. Ellie had been sketching throughout the conversation, capturing Frank's office in remarkable detail. Now she spoke up. Mr. Frank, why do they tell lies about making things beautiful? Why not just ask for money? Frank smiled, the expression transforming. His stern features. Because, sweetheart, the best lies have a little truth mixed in. People want to believe they're doing something good, leaving something behind. These crooks take that noble impulse and twist it. He pulled out another file, this one marked Field Investigation Pending. I drove out to the supposed development site this morning. Want to know what I found? Nothing. Empty land with a rusted gate and a nitrogen monoxide trespassing sign that's been there since the 70s. The security company listed on their materials doesn't exist. The architectural firm dissolved in 2019. Walter felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. How many of his friends were about to lose their life savings to this elaborate fiction? What do you need from me, Frank? The detective's smile turned predatory, the look that had terrified suspects for 4 decades. I need you to arrange a meeting. Get Thornfield to show you the property. I'll tail you, document everything. Meanwhile, he pulled out a small device. Wear this. It's a recording device. Perfectly legal in Connecticut, as long as one party knows about it. Isn't that dangerous? Walter asked. Could be. These people have 5 million reasons to protect their scheme. But they're also arrogant. They think they've already won. That's when crooks make mistakes. Frank walked to a locked cabinet, producing a thick binder. These are my complete case files from the 90s. Every document, every photo, every lead. That went cold. If these are the same people, or their protégés, there might be connections we can use. As they prepared to leave, Frank put a hand on Walter's shoulder. Walt, I need you to understand something. We're not just investigating a financial crime. We're potentially dealing with career criminals who've been doing this for decades. Be careful, both of you. Ellie looked up from her sketch pad, where she'd drawn Frank as a knight in a cardigan, standing guard over file folder dragons. Don't worry, Mr. Frank. Grandpa and I are a good team. He's smart about money, and I notice things. That you do, young lady, that you do. Frank handed Walter a business card. My cell's on there. Call me the moment anything feels wrong. And Walt, trust your gut. In 40 years of police work, instinct saved me more times than any procedure. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Frank's lawn. The silver sedan from earlier was nowhere to be seen, but Walter noticed fresh tire tracks on the normally empty street. Someone had been watching, waiting. Grandpa, Ellie said as they walked to the car, Mr. Frank is scared. I could see it in his eyes. Are we in danger? Walter considered lying, providing the comfortable fiction adults often offered children. But Ellie deserved better. Maybe a little sweetheart. But we're doing the right thing. Sometimes that's scary. She nodded, clutching her sketch pad tighter. Grandma would want us to help people, wouldn't she? Yes, Walter said, thinking of Margaret's fierce protectiveness of those she loved. She absolutely would. As they drove away, Walter made mental notes. Tomorrow, he'd call David Thornfield, express renewed interest in the Heritage Resort. He'd play the eager investor, even as he gathered evidence. 4 days to save his community's future. 4 days to honor Margaret's legacy. The game was no longer just afoot. It was accelerating toward a confrontation that would test every skill Walter had learned in 50 years of reading people, analyzing deals, and protecting wealth. But this time, he had advantages the criminals couldn't have anticipated: a detective's wisdom, a banker's precision, and a 9-year-old's clarity of vision. The Heritage Resort might be a beautiful lie, but the truth had its own power. Now they just had to reveal it before Friday's deadline turned $5 million into vanished dreams. The county records office occupied the basement of a building that had served Fairfield County since 1894. Its narrow windows caught morning. Light filtered through a century of dust, and the air smelled of old paper and legal intentions. Martha Henright, the head clerk, had held her position for 32 years and treated the archives like a sacred trust. Walter Harrington, she said, looking up from behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Haven't seen you down here since the Margarets. Estate paperwork. How are you holding up? Taking it one day at a time, Martha. This is my granddaughter, Ellie. We're doing some research on the old Crestfield property. Martha's expression shifted subtly, a librarian sensing mischief in her domain. That property's been popular lately. Had 3 different groups asking about it in the past month. Very pushy, some of them. She led them deeper into the archives, past shelves that chronicled 2 centuries of property disputes, marriages, deaths, and dreams. Ellie's eyes went wide at the sheer volume of history surrounding them. Here we are, Martha said, pulling out a leather-bound volume with practiced ease. Original land records for the Crestfield tract, 1894 to present. The original deed was a work of art, handwritten in copperplate script with official seals that had faded to brown shadows. Samuel Crestfield had purchased 40 acres for the king, sum of $200, intending to build a mill that never materialized. The land had passed through various hands since then, each transfer meticulously recorded. Now here's where it gets interesting, Martha said, flipping to recent entries. According to this, the property was sold 6 months ago to Morrison Holdings, LLC. But look at this signature. Walter studied the scrawled name. It purported to be Samuel Morrison, the same man Harold had confirmed died in 2018. But something else caught his eye. The notary seal, Patricia Thornfield, he read aloud. Any relation to David Thornfield would be my guess. You'd win that guess, Martha replied. I did some checking after the 3rd inquiry. Patricia Thornfield is David's sister. And here's the kicker. She's not a registered notary in Connecticut. Never has been. Ellie had pulled out her sketch pad and was carefully copying the forged signature. The S is wrong, she announced. Look at the real Mr. Morrison's signature from 1987. He always made his S's like a snake. This one's just loops. Martha and Walter exchanged impressed glances. The child had spotted what they'd missed. The forger had been sloppy with details. Can we see the actual transfer documents? Walter asked. Martha's smile turned grim. That's the other interesting thing. The physical documents are missing. Supposedly sent for digitization 2 months ago. Very convenient timing. She pulled out another folder, this one containing photocopies. Lucky for us, I've been in this job long enough to trust no one. I make copies of everything before it leaves my office. The transfer documents told a story of their own. Morrison Holdings, LLC, had been formed just days before the purchase. Its registered agent listed at the same virtual office address Frank had identified. The purchase price was listed as $1 and other valuable considerations, a legal fiction that obscured the true transaction. Martha, Walter said carefully, have you reported this to anyone? To whom? The police said it's a civil matter until someone files a complaint. The state's attorney's office is backlogged until sometime next century. And the people asking about these records made it very clear they had good lawyers. She leaned closer, her voice dropping. But I've been documenting everything. Every request, every visitor, every discrepancy. 32 years in this job. You develop instincts. These people aren't just crooks, Walter. They're systematic. Professional. Ellie spoke up from where she'd been sketching the archive room. Miss Martha, did any of the pushy people have a butterfly pin? Blue and gold? Martha's face paled slightly. Why, yes. A tall woman with sharp features. She said she was a paralegal, but she didn't know basic legal terms. How did you know? I saw her at the country club, Ellie said simply. She was being mean about old people. Walter felt the pieces clicking together. The Thornfield group wasn't just running a scam. They'd infiltrated the very systems meant to prevent such fraud. Forged documents, fake notaries, intimidation tactics. This was organized crime dressed in business suits. Martha, would you be willing to sign an affidavit about what you've shown us? And could we get certified copies of the original deeds? All ready? Prepared, she said, producing a neat stack of documents. "I had a feeling someone would eventually ask the right questions. I just hoped it would be before people got hurt." As she processed the paperwork, Martha shared more troubling information. The Historical Society was contacted about the Heritage Resort. They were thrilled initially. The development promised to preserve the old Crestfield barn, create a museum. But when they asked for specifics, communication stopped. The president tried to visit the site last week. There's nothing there but empty land and that old no trespassing sign. Walter thought of the glossy brochures' promises, the architectural renderings of buildings that would never exist. How many of his friends had been swayed by the fantasy of leaving a cultural legacy? "One more thing," Martha said as they prepared to leave. "I cross-referenced property records for similar transactions. The Thornfield name, or variations of it, appear in 6 other counties over the past 5 years. Always the same pattern. Quick formation of LLCs, forged documents, properties that never get developed. You're not dealing with first-time criminals." Outside, the March afternoon had turned gray, matching Walter's mood. They sat in his Lincoln for a moment, processing what they'd learned. "Grandpa," Ellie said quietly, "they're like the witch in Hansel and Gretel, aren't they? Making a pretty house to trick people." "That's exactly what they are, sweetheart. But this time, Hansel and Gretel know what's coming." He started the engine, his mind already working through next steps. They had documentation of forgery, evidence of interstate fraud, and a pattern of criminal behavior. But would it be enough to stop Friday's transfers? And more importantly, who could they trust with this information when the Thornfield group seemed to have eyes everywhere? As they pulled away from the courthouse, Walter noticed it again, a silver sedan, different from this morning's, but maintaining the same careful distance. They were being watched, tracked, studied. The hunters were becoming the hunted, but Walter had spent 50 years in finance. He knew something the Thornfield group didn't. The most dangerous opponent was the one with nothing left to lose, but everything to protect. And with Margaret's memory and his community's trust at stake, Walter Harrington was precisely that opponent. The grandfather clock in Walter's study chimed 9 o'clock as he spread the day's findings across his desk. The pool of lamplight illuminated a paper trail of deception, forged deeds, false identities, and enough red flags to outfit a communist parade. Ellie sat cross-legged on the leather sofa, her sketch pad balanced on her knees. Drawing by the fire's warm glow, Walter picked up a letter from the Stack Herald had provided, supposedly for one Robert Jameson of Westport, pledging $200,000 to the Heritage Resort. The letterhead was impressive, the signature confident. There was just one problem. "Ellie," Walter said, reaching for the worn phone directory he still preferred to digital searches. "Would you help me with something?" She joined him at the desk, watching as his fingers walked through the residential listings. Westport, J section. Jackson, Jameson, Janoff. No Jameson. "Maybe he's unlisted, Grandpa." "Perhaps." "Let's try another approach." Walter pulled out his address book, accumulated over 5 decades of business relationships. "I know someone in every major firm in Westport. Let me make some calls." The first 3 calls confirmed what Walter suspected no one had heard of: Robert Jameson. The 4th call, to an old colleague at a wealth management firm, proved more interesting. "Jameson? Sure, I knew Bob Jameson. Died in 2019. Cancer. Why do you ask?" Walter's grip tightened on the receiver. Another ghost, another borrowed identity. After ending the call, he turned to the next letter. This one from Elizabeth Hartwell, of Greenwich, committing $300,000. The phone directory yielded nothing. His contacts knew of a Liz Hartwell. She'd moved to assisted living in Florida 2 years ago. Her estate managed by out-of-state relatives. One by one, Walter and Ellie worked through the investor list. Of 12 names, 7 were deceased. 3 had moved away, and 2 appeared to have never existed at all. It was a roster of phantoms, each lending credibility to a project that was itself a mirage. Why use dead people's names? Ellie asked, adding details to her drawing. A cemetery with $signs for headstones. Social proof, Walter explained, pulling out his journal to document their findings. If potential investors see others have already committed, they feel safer. It's like when your classmates all say they want to go to a party. You're more likely to want to go too. The phone rang, startling them both. Walter checked the caller ID. Spencer Whitman. "Walt, thank God you're home." Spencer's voice was strained. "I've been trying to verify some of the investor names for my own peace of mind. I can't find half of them. What's going on?" Walter chose his words carefully. "I'm having the same concern, Spencer. Can you hold off on your transfer until we get clarity? My wife's already suspicious. She never liked Thornfield, said he smiled too much. Maybe I should listen to her for once." After promising to update Spencer tomorrow, Walter returned to his investigation. A pattern was emerging in the correspondence. The ghost investors all praised specific aspects of the project: the historical, preservation, the architectural integrity, the community benefits. But the language was oddly similar, as if written by the same hand. "Look at this, Ellie." He arranged 5 letters side by side. "See how they all use the phrase, 'wonderful opportunity for our community'? And here, 'preserve the heritage we all cherish.' Same words, just rearranged." Ellie studied the letters with the intensity she usually reserved for particularly challenging jigsaw puzzles. The handwriting's different, but the S's are all wrong, just like at the records office. Walter felt a chill that had nothing to do with the March evening. They weren't just dealing with forgers. They were dealing with someone arrogant enough to repeat mistakes, confident they'd never be caught. The phone rang again. This time it was Harold, and he sounded shaken. "Walt, I just had a visitor." "David." "Thornfield himself. He knows I've been asking questions, made some veiled threats about bank regulations, suggested I might have violated privacy laws by sharing information." "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. But Walt, he mentioned you. Said he heard you were spreading unfounded rumors about the project. These people know we're on to them." After Harold hung up, Walter noticed Ellie had stopped drawing. She was staring at the window, her young face troubled. "Grandpa, there's a car outside." "It's been there since we got home." Walter moved carefully to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. A silver sedan sat under the streetlight, exhaust visible in the cold air. As he watched, a cigarette glowed briefly in the darkness of the driver's seat. He returned to his desk, mind racing. They were being watched, pressured, threatened, but they were also close to something. The Thornfield group wouldn't risk exposure unless they felt cornered. Walter picked up his pen, writing quickly in his journal. Names, dates, connections, everything they'd discovered. If something happened to him, there needed to be a record. He sealed the pages in an envelope, addressed it to Frank Morrison. "Ellie, I need you to do something important," he said, handing her the envelope. "Tomorrow, when your mother picks you up, give this to her. Tell her to mail it if Grandpa doesn't. Call by Friday night. Are we in trouble?" Walter pulled his granddaughter into a hug, feeling the weight of his years and responsibilities. "No, sweetheart. We're doing what's right. Sometimes that's uncomfortable, but it's never trouble." They worked for another hour, Walter making copies of everything, while Ellie finished her drawing. She depicted the ghost investors as transparent, figures surrounding a golden building that was itself fading like smoke. At the center stood 2 solid figures, an elderly man and a young girl, holding hands, holding firm as they prepared for bed. Walter took one last look outside. The sedan was gone, but he knew it would return. The Thornfield group had made a critical error. They'd threatened Harold, tried to intimidate a man who'd survived the financial crisis of 5 decades. They'd revealed their desperation. Tomorrow, Walter would call David Thornfield, accept his invitation to visit the property. He'd wear Frank's recording device, gather the evidence they needed. The ghosts might have fooled others, but they couldn't fool a man who'd spent his life distinguishing real value from pretty lies. In his journal's final entry for the night, Walter wrote, "Margaret always said the truth was like water. It finds its way through eventually. Tomorrow, we open the floodgates." The clock chimed midnight. 3 days until Friday's deadline. 3 days to save his community from a beautiful deception built on the names of the dead. Tuesday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth, the kind of false spring that Connecticut specialized in before delivering one last winter surprise. Harold Pemberton was already at his desk when Walter arrived, surrounded by the tools of financial archaeology, canceled checks, wire transfer records, and a telephone old enough to have its own historical marker. "I've been up since 4, Harold said without preamble. "Couldn't sleep after Thornfield's visit, so I decided to do what I do best, follow the money." He pushed a stack of photocopied checks across the desk. Each one represented someone's dreams converted to negotiable instruments, faith transformed into financial vulnerability. But it was the endorsement stamps that told the real story. "Look at the deposit patterns," Harold said, his finger tracking across the documents. "Every check goes to the same account at Sovereign Bank in Newark. But here's where it gets interesting." He pulled out a wire transfer confirmation. Within hours of each deposit, the money moves. Different amounts to different banks. Classic layering technique. Walter studied the transfer records. The money split like a river delta, some to accounts in Nevada, some to Delaware, smaller amounts to banks in states with strong privacy laws. It was a shell game designed to confuse, to make recovery nearly impossible once the final transfers were executed. "Can you trace where it goes from there?" Harold's smile was grim. "That's where my morning calls came in handy. Remember Ted Morrison from our Harvard days? He's at the Federal Reserve now." I asked him, hypothetically of course, about these routing numbers. He produced a hand-drawn chart, boxes and arrows, creating a web of financial deception. 2 of the receiving banks specialize in international transfers, the kind that can move money to Caribbean accounts in minutes. Once it leaves the country, it's gone. Ellie, who had accompanied Walter for what was becoming their daily investigation, looked up from her sketchpad. "It's like when we play hot potato at school. They keep passing the money until nobody knows who has it." "Exactly right," Harold said, impressed again by the child's perception. "But they made one mistake. This account here?" He pointed to a box on his chart. "It received small amounts from every transfer, always under 10,000, always to the same institution. Alliance Financial Services in Delaware." Walter recognized the name. "That's a payment processor. The kind that handles merchant accounts for businesses." "Precisely. And guess what business uses them?" Harold pulled out a final document with a flourish worthy of a magician. "Thornfield Hospitality Group, registered in Delaware 3 years ago. They're not just running this scam, Walt. They're paying themselves management fees from the stolen money." The audacity of it took Walter's breath away. Not content with stealing millions, the Thornfield Group was essentially charging their victims for the privilege of being robbed. "There's more," Harold continued. "I called in favors from banking friends in other states. Same pattern in Pennsylvania 2 years ago. A Revolutionary Heritage Inn that never materialized. Before that, a Colonial Commons in Virginia. Always the same playbook, always targeting retirees, always with the historical preservation angle." Walter felt anger building in his chest, the kind of cold fury that had served him well in business negotiations. These weren't just criminals. They were predators who had weaponized nostalgia and trust. "Can we freeze the accounts?" "Not without a court order, and that takes time we don't have. But Harold leaned forward, his voice dropping. I've documented everything, every transfer, every pattern, every connection. This is evidence of interstate wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy. The FBI will be very interested. As if summoned by the mention of law enforcement, Walter's cell phone buzzed. Frank Morrison's name appeared on the screen. Walt, where are you? At Harold's bank. Good. Stay there. I've been surveilling the Thornfield Group's office. They're packing up, shredding documents, loading computers into vans. They know we're onto them. Walter felt time compressing, the Thursday deadline suddenly feeling both too far away and too close. What do we do? I've already called my FBI contact. They're mobilizing, but these things take time. We need to keep Thornfield here until they arrive. Can you still meet with him today? Play along, keep him confident? Walter agreed, though the thought of facing David Thornfield while wearing a wire made his 75-year-old heart work harder than his cardiologist would approve. After ending the call, Walter turned back to Harold, who was adding final notations to his financial web. Pemby, I need you to do something that goes against every banking instinct you have. I need you to stall those transfers, but make it look like technical difficulties. Buy us time. Harold nodded slowly. I've been in banking for 52 years without a single ethical violation. But if it saves our friends from losing everything, I'll blame it on a system upgrade. Happens all the time these days. Ellie had been unusually quiet, her pencil moving across paper with determined strokes. Now she showed them her work, drawing of a spider web made of dollar signs, with faceless figures trapped at various points. At the center sat a spider wearing a business suit and a false smile. The spider thinks it's smart, she said quietly, but it doesn't know there's a bird watching. Walter hugged his granddaughter, drawing strength from her clarity. In just 2 days, she'd shown more insight than adults with decades of experience. Perhaps that was the gift of innocence, the ability to see evil without the filters of rationalization and social nicety. Harold began making calls, his voice taking on the harried tone of a banker dealing with technical catastrophe. Yes, I understand your transfer was scheduled. No, I can't give you a timeline. The entire system's down, ... I assure you, your money is safe. While Harold played his part, Walter prepared for his. He checked Frank's recording device, tested the battery, practiced keeping his voice natural while wearing the wire. The meeting with Thornfield was scheduled for 2 o'clock, a tour of the property that didn't exist, promises of a project that would never be. Walt, Harold said between calls, whatever happens, you've done the right thing. Margaret would be proud. Walter thought of his late wife, her fierce protectiveness of those she loved, her intolerance for those who preyed on the vulnerable. She'd have solved this faster, he said, and probably made Thornfield cry in the process. They shared a moment of remembrance before returning to the battle at hand. Harold's phone rang constantly now, investors anxious about their transfers, his staff confused by the system failure, and increasingly, David Thornfield himself. He's called 3 times, Harold reported, getting more agitated each time. He knows something's wrong, but can't pinpoint what. Walter stood, straightening his tie. Good. Desperate people make mistakes. Ellie, you'll stay here with Uncle Harold until your mother comes. I don't want you near Thornfield. Be careful, Grandpa, she said, presenting him with a drawing she'd torn from her pad. It showed a knight in a business suit, shield raised against a dragon made of dollar signs. For luck. Walter folded the drawing carefully, placing it in his jacket pocket next to the recording device. Armed with evidence, protected by friends, and inspired by a 9-year-old's courage, he prepared to face the dragon in its lair dot as he left the bank. Walter noticed them immediately. 2 silver sedans, engines running, positioned to follow regardless of which direction he chose. The Thornfield Group was taking no chances, but neither was Walter Harrington. 50 years in finance had taught him that the most dangerous moment in any negotiation was when both parties knew the game was ending. The only question now was who would blink first. The Thursday deadline loomed like a storm front. But today, Tuesday, with the sun breaking through clouds and checks floating in electronic limbo, today was when the trap would close, either on the criminals who had haunted his community or on an old man who dared to challenge them. Walter started his Lincoln, Ellie's drawing a talisman in his pocket, and drove toward a confrontation 5 decades of experience had prepared him for. The money trail had led them this far. Now it was time to follow it to its source, the Fairfield country. Club's private dining room had been reserved for what David Thornfield called an exclusive investor's preview. The space normally hosted wedding receptions and retirement parties, celebrations of life's passages. Today, it would witness a different kind of transition, from deception to revelation. Walter arrived to find 24 of his peers already assembled, their faces showing the mixture of excitement and uncertainty that accompanied any significant investment. Judge Harrison held court near the bar. Spencer Whitman nervously checked his phone, and Martha Pemberton, Harold's sister, clutched her purse like a life preserver. David Thornfield stood at the front of the room, his $1,000 suit and practiced smile intact despite the morning's setbacks. Beside him, the woman Ellie had sketched angular features, butterfly pin gleaming on her lapel, arranged documents on a display table. "Walter!" Thornfield's voice boomed with false bonhomie. "So glad you could make it. I understand you've been asking questions about our project. Due diligence is admirable. Exactly what I'd expect from someone of your reputation." Walter felt the recording device's weight against his chest as he shook Thornfield's hand. The grip was firm, confident, the handshake of a man who'd perfected the art of the first impression. "Just want to make sure everything's solid," Walter replied. "My friends trust my judgment, as they should. Patricia," Thornfield gestured to the woman, "show Mr. Harrington the updated projections. I think he'll be impressed by the returns we're forecasting." Patricia Thornfield's smile was sharp as winter ice. "Of course, we've actually increased the projected ROI based on early interest. The historical preservation tax credits alone will provide substantial benefits." Walter accepted the documents, noting the expensive paper, the professional binding, every detail designed to convey legitimacy. But he also noticed something else, a slight tremor in Patricia's hands, a tightness around David's eyes. They knew something was wrong. "Before we proceed," Walter said, loud enough to carry, "I have a few concerns I'd like to address." The room quieted, 24 faces turning toward him. Thornfield's smile remained, but his posture shifted subtly. A predator recognizing potential threat. "By all means," Thornfield said. "Transparency is our watchword." Walter pulled out Harold's documentation, spreading it on the nearest table. "Can you explain why your investor list includes Robert Jameson, who died in 2019, or Elizabeth Hartwell, who's been in assisted living since 2022? A murmur ran through the room. Spencer Whitman stood straighter, Judge Harrison's jovial expression fading. Thornfield's laugh was practiced, dismissive. "I'm afraid there's been some confusion. We have many investors with common names. And can you explain?" Walter continued, his voice carrying the authority of 5 decades in business. "Why the deed to the Crestfield property was notarized by your sister, who isn't licensed in Connecticut, or why the property owner's signature is dated 3 months ago, when Samuel Morrison died in 2018. The murmur became an uproar. Martha Pemberton gasped. Judge Harrison's face went red, his judicial temperament cracking. "These are serious accusations," Thornfield said, his smile finally slipping. "I hope you have proof, Mr. Harrington. Slander lawsuits can be quite costly." That's when a small voice piped up from the doorway. "I have proof." Everyone turned to see Ellie standing there, her mother. Jennifer beside her, both breathing hard as if they'd been running. In Ellie's hands was her sketch pad and something else, a small pink device covered in stickers. "Ellie, I told you to stay at the bank," Walter said, torn between concern and confusion. "I'm sorry, Grandpa, but I remembered something important." She held up the pink device, my spy toy. "The one Mommy got me for Christmas. I left it in the powder room on Sunday because I wanted to catch the ghost that makes the toilets run." Jennifer stepped forward, her expression a mixture of maternal protection and dawning understanding. "It's a toy recorder, Walter. She's been playing detective all month." When she told me what she'd overheard, I didn't believe it at first, but then she played me this. Ellie pressed a button on the toy. The sound quality was tinny, but clear enough. Patricia Thornfield's voice filled the room. "I can't believe they're falling for it." Another woman's laugh then. "These old fools think they're buying history. They're buying us a beach house in Costa Rica." The recording continued. Details about offshore accounts, mentions of previous scams, contempt for elderly marks who were too proud to admit they'd been fooled. The room erupted. Judge Harrison's judicial vocabulary expanded to include words that would have cleared his courtroom. Spencer Whitman lunged toward Thornfield, held back only by other members. Martha Pemberton sank into a chair, clutching her chest. David Thornfield's transformation was remarkable. The polished entrepreneur dissolved, replaced by something feral and dangerous. He grabbed for the recorder, but Jennifer pulled Ellie back, placing herself between her daughter and the con man. "You have no idea who you're messing with," Thornfield snarled, his cultivated accent slipping. "That recording's inadmissible. You've got nothing." Actually, a new voice said from the doorway, "They've got everything they need." Frank Morrison entered, no longer the retired detective in a comfortable cardigan, but a predator in his own right. Behind him, 3 FBI agents in dark suits spread out, blocking exits. "David Thornfield, Patricia Thornfield, you're under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit fraud across state lines." Frank's smile was all teeth. "Oh, and that recording? Connecticut's a one-party consent state for minors accompanied by parents. Perfectly legal." As the agents moved in, Patricia made a break for the service door. She might have made it, but Martha Pemberton's purse, weighted with a lifetime of pragmatic items, caught her in the shins. The con woman went down hard, her butterfly pins skittering across the floor. "That's for trying to steal my retirement, you witch," Martha said with satisfaction. The arrests were swift, professional. As the Thornfields were led away in handcuffs, David locked eyes with Walter. "You think you've won? Our lawyers will have use out by dinner." "Perhaps," Walter said calmly. "But your accounts are frozen. Your previous victims have been notified, and 5 states' attorneys general are very interested in talking to you. Enjoy your dinner. I suspect it will be served on a metal tray for the foreseeable future." As chaos gave way to relieved chatter, Walter found himself surrounded by grateful friends. But his eyes sought Ellie, standing proud beside her mother, toy recorder still clutched in her hands. "You disobeyed me," he said sternly, then smiled. "Thank God. How did you know to come here?" "Uncle Harold got worried when you didn't check in, and I remembered about the recorder when Mommy asked why I'd been drawing the mean ladies. I knew you needed proof, Grandpa. Real proof, not just papers." Walter knelt, his knees protesting, and hugged his granddaughter. "You saved everyone, sweetheart. You're the real detective here." "We're a team," Ellie corrected. "You and Uncle Harold found the paper clues. Mr. Frank caught the bad guys. I just remembered to check my spy toy." Judge Harrison approached, his face still flushed, but now with relief rather than rage. "Walter, I owe you an apology, and a debt." "We all do." Around the room, similar sentiments echoed. But Walter's attention was on Frank, who was directing the FBI agents with practiced efficiency. "The Delaware accounts?" Walter asked quietly. "Already frozen," Frank confirmed. "We'll recover most of it." The Thornfields were greedy. They hadn't moved the money offshore yet, wanted to collect every last penny first. Greed. It had built the trap and ultimately sprung it. Walter thought of Margaret, how she would have enjoyed seeing arrogance bring its own downfall. As the country club slowly returned to normal, members comforting each other, sharing relief and residual fear. Ellie tugged on Walter's sleeve. "Grandpa, can we go home? I want to draw this for my journal. The day we caught the bad guys." Walter smiled, lifting her into his arms despite his back's protests. "We can do better than that. How about we stop for ice cream on the way? Heroes deserve a celebration." As they left, Walter noticed the afternoon sun had broken through completely, warming the March air with promise of spring. The Thursday deadline had been defeated. The community was safe. And a 9-year-old with a toy recorder had reminded him that sometimes the most powerful truths came from the most unexpected sources. The FBI's Hartford field office hummed with the controlled chaos of a major investigation hitting its stride. Walter sat in a conference room that smelled of burnt coffee and determination, watching agents piece together the full scope of the Thornfield Group's operations. Ellie sat beside him, special permission granted after Frank explained her crucial role in breaking the case. Special Agent Sarah Chun led the briefing, her manner crisp and professional, despite having worked through the night. "What you uncovered, Mr. Harrington, is just the Connecticut branch of a much larger operation. The Thornfields, whose real names are David and Patricia Kowalski, have been running variations of this scam for 12 years. She clicked a remote, and faces appeared on the screen. The Thornfields at various ages, in different states, with different hair colors, but the same predatory smiles. They started in Florida in 2013, a sunset heritage community that bilked retirees out of $3 million. Moved to Virginia, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. Always the same pattern. Fake historical preservation, phantom investors, forged documents. How did they avoid getting caught for so long? Walter asked. Agent Chun's expression tightened. They were smart. Never stayed in one place too long. Used different aliases. Created elaborate backstories. And they chose their victims carefully. Older investors who might be embarrassed to admit they'd been fooled. Communities where trust was assumed. She clicked again. Financial records filled the screen, a spider web that made Harold's hand-drawn. Chart looked simple by comparison, but they got greedy. Instead of disappearing after each score, they started building an actual business structure. Shell companies, payment processors, even hired unknowing employees to answer phones and maintain their legitimacy. Frank leaned forward from his position by the door. The Connecticut job was supposed to be their biggest score. $5 million would have set them up for life. They got sloppy. Thanks to your granddaughter. Agent Chun smiled at Ellie, who was sketching the conference room with intense concentration. That recording gave us probable cause. The documents you and Mr. Pemberton provided showed the methods. Mr. Morrison's surveillance, she nodded to Frank, caught them destroying evidence. But it's what we found in their computers that really tells the story. The screen changed again. Lists of names, addresses, financial information. Walter recognized many from the country club, but there were hundreds more. They kept records of every potential mark. Assessment notes, vulnerability ratings, approach strategies. Your name, Mr. Harrington, had a note. Pillar of community. If we get him, we get them all. Walter felt a chill. He'd been targeted not just as an investor, but as a Judas goat to lead others to slaughter. There's more, Agent Chun continued. We found correspondence with similar operations in 6 other states. This isn't just fraud. It's organized crime specifically targeting elderly Americans. The FBI is treating this as a major case. The door opened and Harold entered, looking tired but vindicated. Sorry I'm late. Been at the bank since dawn processing. The reverse transfers. Everyone's getting their money back. Walt, every penny. Relief washed over Walter. His community was safe, their trust preserved along with their savings. Agent Chun turned to Ellie. Young lady, I understand you've been documenting this investigation with your drawings. Would you mind if we looked at them? Sometimes artistic observations catch things reports miss. Ellie glanced at Walter, who nodded encouragingly. She handed over her sketchpad. Suddenly, shy-dot, the agents flipped through the pages, their professional demeanor cracking as they saw the case through a child's eyes. The butterfly pin featured prominently, rendered in careful detail. The mean ladies with their fake smiles. Her grandfather and great-uncle Harold as knights fighting paper dragons. Frank Morrison as a wise owl watching from the shadows. This one, Agent Chun paused at a drawing from the country club. This man in the background, who is he? Ellie leaned over to look. Oh, him. He was at the club on Sunday and again yesterday. He kept watching Mr. Thornfield, but never talked to him. He had a scar on his hand, shaped like a moon. The agents exchanged glances. Chun pulled out her phone, spoke rapidly, then turned back to the group. We've been looking for a third conspirator. Someone who scouted locations, did advance work. This could be the break we need. Frank studied the drawing more closely. I've seen him. Drives a silver sedan. I thought he was just hired muscle. Check parking lot surveillance from the country club. Shun ordered one of her agents. Cross-reference. With hotel registrations, rental cars. If he's still in the area. The energy in the room shifted, the investigation suddenly active again. Walter marveled at how Ellie's artistic eye had captured what trained investigators had missed. Mr. Harrington, Agent Chun said, we're going to need formal statements from you, Mr. Pemberton. And Mr. Morrison, the U.S. Attorney is fast-tracking this case. With your evidence and what we've uncovered, the Kowalskis are looking at 20 years minimum. What about the other states' victims? Walter asked. The ones who weren't as fortunate as we were? We're working on asset recovery. The Kowalskis lived well, but they also hoarded. Offshore accounts, real estate, luxury goods. It'll take time, but we'll get back what we can. As the meeting wound down, Ellie tugged on Walter's sleeve. Grandpa, the mean ladies won't hurt anyone else, will they? No, sweetheart. Thanks to you, they're done hurting people. Agent Chun knelt to Ellie's level. You know, the FBI has a junior special agent program for kids who help solve cases. Would you like a certificate? Ellie's eyes went wide. Really? Can I show it at school? Absolutely. In fact, Chun looked at Walter, we'd like to recognize all of you. What you did, using traditional investigation methods, community connections, and good old-fashioned instinct. It's a textbook example of how citizens can work with law enforcement. As they prepared to leave, Walter felt the weight of the past few days settling on his shoulders. They'd won, but it had been closer than he cared to admit. How many other communities were facing similar threats? How many other elderly investors were being targeted by people who saw them as nothing more than walking bank accounts? Mr. Harrington, Agent Chun called as they reached the door. One more thing. We're developing a presentation about elder fraud, using this case as an example. Would you consider speaking at it? Your perspective would be invaluable. Walter thought of Margaret, of the promise he'd made to protect not just wealth, but wisdom. I'd be honored. Outside, the Wednesday afternoon was crisp and bright. As Harold drove them back to Fairfield, Ellie worked on a new drawing. This one showed the FBI office as a castle, with good knights arresting the dragons. In the corner, she drew herself, her grandfather, Harold, and Frank, a small but determined band who'd refused to let evil win. You know what the best part is? Ellie said, adding final touches to her drawing. What's that, sweetheart? We did it the old-fashioned way. No computers, no fancy stuff. Just people paying attention and caring about each other. Walter smiled, thinking of all the technology the FBI had deployed, all the modern investigative techniques. But at its heart, Ellie was right. They'd solved this case with the most ancient tools of all: community, trust, and the courage to speak truth to power. The Heritage Resort would never be built, but something more valuable had been constructed. A bridge between generations, a reminder that wisdom and innocence working together could overcome any deception. As they neared home, Walter began composing his speech for the FBI presentation in his mind. He'd tell them about paper trails, personal connections, about the power of knowing your community. But mostly, he'd tell them about a 9-year-old girl with a toy recorder and an artist's eye, who'd seen clearly what experience had taught adults to overlook. The web had been unraveled, the spiders caught. But the most important lesson wasn't about the criminals they'd stopped. It was about the bonds they'd strengthened, the trust they'd preserved, and the proof that in an age of digital deception, human connection remained the most powerful force of all. The federal courthouse in Hartford stood like a monument to justice, its limestone facade catching the morning sun. 6 months had passed since the country club confrontation, and today the case of United States v. Kowalski would reach its conclusion. Walter adjusted his tie in the courthouse lobby, Ellie beside him in her best dress, sketchpad tucked under her arm as always. "Remember," Jennifer said, smoothing her daughter's hair, "you just answer the questions honestly. The truth is all they need." The courtroom gallery was packed with familiar faces. Harold sat in the front row, having testified the previous day about the financial trail he'd uncovered. Frank Morrison was conferring with the prosecutors, his detective instincts still sharp in retirement. Judge Harrison had come to observe, his professional interest mixed with personal investment in the case. The defendants sat at their table, orange jumpsuits replacing designer suits. The transformation was striking. David Kowalski looked deflated, his charm evaporated, while Patricia stared straight ahead with bitter defiance. The third conspirator, Marcus Webb, whom Ellie's drawing had helped identify, sat separately, having turned state's evidence in exchange for a reduced sentence. "All rise," the bailiff intoned, and the Honorable Ruth Weinstein took her seat. She was known for her no-nonsense approach to white-collar crime, and her expression promised the defendants no mercy. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chong, called Walter to the stand first. For 45 minutes, Walter detailed the investigation, his voice steady as he recounted the ghost investors, the forged documents, the systematic targeting of elderly victims. "Mr. Harrington," Chong asked, "what would have happened if the young scheme had succeeded?" Walter looked at the gallery, seeing his friends and neighbors. 23 families would have lost their life savings. Some would have had to sell their homes. Others would have become burdens to their children, which for proud, independent people is worse than poverty. The Kowalskis didn't just try to steal money. They tried to steal dignity. The defense attorney's cross-examination was perfunctory. The evidence was overwhelming, and Walter's credibility unassailable. Then came Ellie's turn. The judge had approved her testimony with special accommodations: a lower chair, her mother nearby, and permission to draw if it helped her stay calm. "Ellie," Chong said gently, "can you tell us about the recording you made?" In her clear, young voice, Ellie recounted the Sunday at the country club, her spy toys placement, and the accidental recording that had broken the case open. She was remarkably composed, answering each question with the same attention to detail she brought to her drawings. "The lady with the butterfly pin," Ellie said, pointing to Patricia Kowalski. She laughed when she talked about the old people. It wasn't a nice laugh. It was like when Jimmy Peterson pulls wings off flies at recess. Mean. The comparison, so apt in its childish simplicity, resonated through the courtroom. Several jurors' expressions hardened. During a recess, Walter found himself in the hallway with other victims from different states who'd traveled to see justice done. A couple from Pennsylvania who'd lost their farm fund. A widow from Virginia whose husband's life insurance had vanished into the Kowalskis' accounts. They shared stories, anger, and ultimately, relief that it was ending. "Your granddaughter," the widow said to Walter. "She's remarkable. So brave." Walter glanced through the courtroom doors, where Ellie was showing her drawings to the court reporter. "Children see clearly. We adults learn to doubt our instincts, to rationalize red flags. Ellie just saw people being mean and knew it was wrong." The afternoon brought the defendant's last desperate attempt at sympathy. David Kowalski took the stand, spinning a tale of difficult childhood, addiction struggles, and good intentions gone wrong. But Chong's cross-examination was surgical, using the defendant's own records against them. These vulnerability assessments, Chong held up documents seized from Kowalski's computer, where you rated elderly targets based on their isolation, cognitive decline, and liquid assets. Were those part of your good intentions? Kowalski had no answer. The closing arguments were a formality. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records meticulously traced by Harold, surveillance footage and witness testimony gathered by Frank, and the damning recording captured by a 9-year-old's toy. But it was Chong's final words that resonated. The defendants viewed our elderly citizens as easy marks, forgetting that these are people who built our communities, who worked lifetimes for their security. They thought age meant weakness. They were wrong. Age means wisdom, experience, and in this case, the connections and courage to fight back. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Walter held Ellie's hand as the verdicts were read. Guilty. Guilty. 37 counts of wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and racketeering. The sentences would come later, but the prosecutor had indicated they'd seek the maximum, potentially 25 years for the primary conspirators. As the defendants were led away, Patricia Kowalski turned to stare at Ellie with naked hatred, but the little girl met her gaze steadily, then returned to her drawing, the scales of justice, perfectly balanced. Outside the courthouse, the media waited. Walter had agreed to a brief statement, knowing it might help other communities recognize similar schemes. "Elder fraud is a silent epidemic," he said into the microphones. "The criminals count on shame, on isolation, on our reluctance to admit we've been fooled. But we're not victims, we're survivors. And when we stand together, when we trust each other, we're unstoppable." Frank added his perspective, praising the collaboration between citizens and law enforcement. Harold spoke about the importance of traditional banking relationships in catching financial crimes, but it was Ellie who stole the show. "My grandpa taught me that money is trust," she said, clutching her junior FBI certificate. "When people steal money, they're really stealing trust. That's why we had to stop them." The sound bite would play on every news channel. The image of the little girl with the sketch pad becoming symbolic of how communities could protect themselves. As they walked to Walter's car, autumn leaves crunching underfoot, he reflected on the journey from that March morning when Ellie had first tugged his sleeve. Justice had been served, but more importantly, faith had been restored. Faith in institutions, in neighbors, in the possibility that good could triumph over greed. "Grandpa," Ellie said as they drove home, "will there be other bad people trying to trick old people?" "Probably, sweetheart. Bad people don't go away just because we catch some of them. Then we'll have to keep watching, won't we? Like detectives." Walter smiled, thinking of the FBI presentation he'd given the previous month. The Elder Fraud Task Force being formed with Harold and Frank as advisors. The community workshop spreading awareness. Double quotes, yes, we'll keep watching. But more importantly, we'll keep talking to each other, trusting each other. That's the best defense against people like the Kowalskis. Ellie nodded, already sketching the courthouse in fading light. In her drawing, it stood tall and strong, a fortress against those who would prey on the vulnerable. And in front of it, she drew a small figure with a sketch pad, a guardian in her own right, proof the heroes came in all ages and that truth, clearly seen and bravely spoken, would always find its way to light. The first snow of winter dusted. Walter studied windows as he sat at his desk, fountain pen moving across the pages of a new journal. This one had been a gift from Ellie, leather-bound like all the others, but with a special edition. A small sketch of an owl in the corner of the cover, her symbol for wisdom. A year had passed since the Heritage Resort scandal, and the study, that had once been his solitary refuge, now regularly hosted a different kind of meeting. Ellie sat across from him, her own notebook open, pencil ready. "Today's lesson," Walter said, his voice carrying the warmth of a grandfather and the authority of 5 decades in finance, "is about compound interest. But not the kind that grows money, the kind that grows trust." Ellie drew 2 trees as he spoke, one small, one large. "Like how telling the truth once makes it easier to tell it again." Exactly. Every honest action builds on the last, creating something stronger over time. They'd been meeting weekly since the trial, Walter teaching Ellie about ethical investing, financial literacy, and the responsibilities that came with wealth. But she taught him too, about seeing with fresh eyes, about the courage to speak uncomfortable truths, about the power of simple observations. The door opened, and Jennifer peered in. "Dad, the others are here." The study filled with familiar faces. Harald, carrying his ever-present ledger. Frank, whose cardigan collection had expanded since his consulting work with the FBI increased. Judge Harrison, Martha Pemberton, Spencer Whitman, and 6 others from the country club who'd formed what they semi-jokingly called the Fraud Squad. "All right, everyone," Walter called the meeting to order. "Harold, what's our status?" Harold opened his ledger with ceremony. "The Fairfield Elder Protection Fund stands at $127,000. We've helped identify 3 potential scams in the past 6 months, provided financial literacy workshops to over 200 seniors, and our volunteer network now covers 4 counties." It had started small, just the country club members meeting to share their experience. But word spread. Other communities reached out. The FBI presentation Walter gave had led to a partnership. Now they were a model for grassroots elder fraud prevention. "Frank?" Walter turned to the detective. 2 arrests last month in Bridgeport. Similar scheme to the Kowalskis, but much smaller scale. They'd studied the Heritage Resort case, thought they could do better. Frank's grin was wolfish. They thought wrong. Martha Pemberton raised her hand. "I've been corresponding with that widow from Virginia, Eleanor Hartley. She started a similar group there. Wants to know if Ellie would draw a logo for them." All eyes turned to the youngest member of their group. Ellie had become something of a folk hero in elder fraud prevention circles. Her drawings appeared in FBI pamphlets. Her story inspired other communities to trust their instincts and speak up. "I'd be happy to," Ellie said, already sketching ideas. "Maybe an owl protecting a nest? Owls are wise, and nests are homes that need protecting." The meeting continued with updates, plans, and the comfortable banter of people who'd been through fire together and emerged stronger. But Walter's attention kept drifting to the journal before him, to the entry he'd been writing when they arrived. Later, after the others had gone, and Ellie was helping her mother in the kitchen, Walter completed his entry. Margaret always said, "Our true legacy wasn't what we left behind, but what we passed forward. This year has taught me she was right. The money we saved from the Kowalskis matters, but not as much as the trust we preserved, the connections we strengthened, and the wisdom we've shared. Ellie carries forward more than our family's financial security. She carries the understanding that wealth means responsibility, That community means watching out for each other, and that the truth, simply told, is the most powerful weapon against deception. The Heritage Resort was never built, but something more lasting rose in its place. A network of neighbors who look out for each other, a bridge between generations, and proof that wisdom and innocence working together can overcome any deception. Today, I watched Ellie explain compound interest using acorns and oak trees. She understands what took me decades to learn, that the greatest returns come not from clever schemes, but from patient trust, carefully tended and faithfully preserved. The Kowalskis are serving their sentences. The FBI tells us our case has prevented dozens of similar frauds. But our real victory is smaller and larger than that. It's in every conversation between grandparent and grandchild about money and values. It's in every community that decides to pay attention, to ask questions, to trust their instincts. Margaret, my dear, we kept it safe. Not just the money, but the wisdom, the integrity, the connections that make a community strong. And in Ellie, we have a guardian for the next generation. One who sees clearly, speaks bravely, and draws the truth in simple lines that no deception can blur. Walter set down his pen as Ellie returned, carrying a tray with tea and her grandmother's china cups, another tradition preserved and passed forward. "Grandpa," she said, setting the tray carefully on his desk, "Mom says I can join your presentation at the senior center next week. Can I bring my new drawings?" "Of course. Which ones?" She showed him her latest work, a series of illustrations depicting common fraud schemes in simple, clear imagery. Red flags were literal red flags. Too good to be true offers showed as candy. Houses with witch shadows. High-pressure tactics appeared as clocks with angry faces. The FBI lady, Asian Chun, says they might use these in their national campaign, Ellie said proudly. She says I make complex things simple. You do indeed. Walter sipped his tea, the warmth spreading through his chest. You know what I've been thinking about lately? What? That Sunday at the country club when you tugged my sleeve. Such a small gesture, but it changed everything. It saved our community millions of dollars, put criminals in jail, and started a movement. All because you paid attention and had the courage to speak up. Ellie considered this, her young face serious. I was scared to tell you. I thought you might not believe me. But then I remembered what Grandma used to say. The truth is like a light. Even a small candle can show what's hiding in the dark. Walter's throat tightened. He'd told Ellie it saying countless times, one of Margaret's favorites, but hearing it reflected back gave it new meaning. Shall we review the investment proposals for next week? He asked, changing the subject before emotion overwhelmed him. They spent the next hour going through legitimate investment opportunities from local businesses, a bakery expansion, a youth center renovation, a senior transportation service. Each proposal was evaluated, not just for financial return, but for community impact. Another lesson learned from their ordeal. As the afternoon sun began to fade, casting the study in golden light, Ellie made her final drawing of the day. It showed two figures, an elderly man and a young girl, standing before a great tree. The tree's roots, labeled with words like trust, wisdom, and courage, ran deep. Its branches, reaching toward the sky, bore fruit marked community, justice, and hope. That's us, she explained unnecessarily, and that's what we're growing. Walter nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. In 50 years of carefully managed investments, he'd never produced a return as valuable as this. A granddaughter who understood that true wealth lay not in what you accumulated, but in what you protected. Not in what you gained, but in what you gave forward. The Heritage Resort had promised to preserve history. Instead, its failure had preserved something far more precious, the bonds between generations, the wisdom of age, paired with the clarity of youth, and the eternal truth that community, when united, could overcome any deception. As Ellie packed up her drawings and prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "Same time next week, Grandpa? Same time next week, partner." She grinned and was gone, leaving Walter alone with his journals, his memories, and the comfortable certainty that the legacy he and Margaret had built would continue long after the last entry was written. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white. But in Walter's study, warmed by fire and memory, the future had never looked brighter. The deal had indeed been a scam, but from its ashes had risen something real, something lasting, something no con artist could ever steal: the unbreakable bond between those who choose to stand together, watch out for one another, and speak truth in a world too often clouded by beautiful lies.